Today I'd like to introduce my new friend, and because he's my newest friend, I need notes. Many of you already know Mr. Berry, but just wanted to share with you a few interesting things I've learned about him. Mr. Berry has served as a football coach, a journalist, an historian, an author, and a civic leader in the areas of flood protection, influenza, and risk communication. He has a very long list of accomplishments, but he wanted as much time as possible, so let me just, I have about 5 I wanted to share with you. Besides that he is a gifted, award-winning author, as many of y'all know, since you've asked for autographs today, but the breadth of his knowledge is in science, sports, and politics. His books have received numerous awards. Some include the New York Times bestseller list, and Historical, Scientific, and Library Society. That's kind of a wide group there. 3 of the most notable books that I saw on his website was Rising Tide, The Greatest Mississippi Flood of 1937 and How It Changed America, The Great Influenza, The Epic Story of the Deadliest Plague in History, and Power Plays, Politics, Football, and Other Blood Sports, A Look at Power. I think each one looked very interesting, and I plan to read them soon. He's also the only, in 2006, he became the only non-scientist ever to address the National Academies of Science annual Woman Distinguished Lecture. So, being an engineer, I know how scientists can be, so that's quite an honor. His research and knowledge has not only been used to write books, but he's also used to help his community. After Hurricane Katrina, Mr. Berry was appointed to chair a bipartisan working group in New Orleans area in the southeast part of the state, the Southeast Louisiana Flood Protection Authority, and he served from 2007 to 2013. The purpose of the committee was to address the New Orleans levee districts. In addition, he served on the Louisiana Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority, whose responsibility is to, address the state's hurricane protection needs. With that knowledge, he's here today to talk about the subject today. His tenure on the board, during his tenure on the board, Mr. Berry was the chief architect of a lawsuit against 97 oil and gas companies requesting compensation for wetland loss due to oil field and pipeline activities. That was a result of some of the things he had seen during his tenure on the board. And after leaving the authority, Mr. Berry formed a nonprofit group called Restore Louisiana Now. So I'd like to introduce Mr. Berry.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you very much for coming. Even I flinched a little bit when Mark said 97 oil companies. I want you to know that I am not a radical. Our board is majority Republican. One of my closest friends on the board and one of the strongest supporters of the lawsuit described himself to the press as a right-wing extremist, and I can tell you he is. I myself work for oil companies, like many people in Louisiana, and indeed I won an award from one of the defendants. But let me give you some of the background that led to the lawsuit. The Flood Protection Authority, which I usually refer to as the Levee Board, was a reform body formed after Katrina. The old board was highly political and did not have anybody on it who was a flood expert. The new board had to go through a selection process. We were insulated from politics because we could not be, unlike every other board in the state, we could not be removed by the governor. I was removed because my term expired. I was not reappointed. And we were also, it was a board of flood experts. We had a past president of the American Society of Civil Engineers. It was coast to coast from California. We had a guy 30 years in flood protection. He'd been chief engineer for the state of California, 1,600 miles of levees, and also head of the floodplain management for the state of California. From the University of North Carolina, we had the author of the most sophisticated storm surge model in the world. He's consulted on any major storm anywhere in the world. We had 4 members out of 9 on the board who participated routinely in working groups, the National Academy of Engineering. We have another guy who writes textbooks, who's written textbooks from college. This was an all-star board. And it was majority Republican, although not all of them were as conservative as my friend, the right-wing extremist. And when we looked at the problems facing the New Orleans metropolitan area in the future years, looking in the out years, and we looked at the increasing threat to the city and our responsibility in protecting people's lives. That's what we were there for. 2 members of the board lost everything in Katrina, and everybody on the board knew somebody who lost everything in Katrina. So we took that responsibility very seriously. And there was like one project, a single project. To give you an example, I don't know how well you know the geography around New Orleans, but there's what we refer to as a land bridge that extends out into Lake Pontchartrain from New Orleans east, goes almost all the way across the lake to Slidell, and that's eroded. If that disappears, then the ocean pours into Lake Pontchartrain, threatens people who never dreamed they'd ever be threatened by a hurricane, practically all the way to Baton Rouge. And just keeping that land bridge in place cost $1.2 billion, according to a study we conducted. So we started again to look at the causes of the, and that's just one project, of course there are many others. We started looking at the causes that were leading to this increased risk. And there are many causes. No one associated with the lawsuit has ever said, and I certainly have never said, that the oil and gas industry is responsible for all the problems. It is not. I was just talking to Mark earlier today, talking about 6 dams on the upper Missouri River that retain 100 million, 125 million tons actually, of sediment a year that used to come down here, and we no longer have access to that. I mean, there are multiple causes, and the levees, of course, are one of the causes. But of those multiple causes, one of the causes, and a significant player in the causation, is the oil and gas industry. So we started thinking about whether or not there was some way to have one of the parties that caused part of the problem ask them to fix the part of the problem that they caused. And the result is that we did go forward and engage in who incidentally has also worked for Mike Foster. Mike Foster, who you may recall hates lawsuits. He sued Exxon. He used our attorney. You know, what it comes down to is, as I'll say as we go for, well, you know, long before we filed the lawsuit, on December 4th, 2012, we sat down. We had not yet decided to go forward. We were thinking about it and started exploring it. We sat down with Garrett Graves, the governor's coastal guy. The coastals are in charge of everything on the coast. And we told him what we were considering doing. And on the one hand, he certainly didn't bless the lawsuit. On the other hand, in a way, he convinced us to go forward. Because I said to him, we were thinking about perhaps talking about going to Chris John, the former congressman who's the head of the Louisiana Mid-Continent Oil and Gas Association, trade association for majors, and asking him, maybe we should work something out voluntarily. Plus, we know the problem is statewide, or at least coastwide. It's not just in the New Orleans metro area. It's actually worse west of the Mississippi River than it is east of the river, and our jurisdiction was on only the east bank of the river. And Garrett said to us, and this is really what clinched the decision to go forward for our board, said, I already talked to Chris John. They're not there yet. So the governor's guy knows there's liability in the industry, which he says publicly 1,000 times. He thinks the industry should pay more. That's why I went to Chris John. And Chris John says, no, they're not there yet. So how do you bring someone who's liable for something to the table? That's what we want. We want people to come to the table. And ultimately, what this lawsuit is about is several things. One is right up there. Is it the truth? You ask yourself whether what I'm telling you is the truth, and then you can ask yourself when you hear some people on the other side whether what they're telling you is the truth, and make a decision. The other things that this is about is what every one of you hopes everybody in every community teaches their kids. You keep your word, you obey the law, and you take responsibility for your actions. That's really what it is about. Now we'll start out, now get to the substance of the slideshow here. And as I said, there are multiple causes. One of them is oil and gas. This is about 20 miles south of New Orleans. It's in St. Bernard Parish. And the top left is 1956. You basically see an intact landmass. That's decades after blast saw any sediment from the Mississippi River, which is off about 5 miles to the left in these pictures. And the next picture, this is 1965. How do I get the laser? Well, I don't, maybe that's the laser. Nope, that's not it. I'm not real good on PowerPoint, I shouldn't have tried that. How do I get rid of that? Well, we won't get rid of it. Okay, or does somebody else know how to get rid of it? No. Okay, on the top right, you see that canal. That was dredged in 1961. It was a dry hole. According to the permit, it should have been plugged immediately. It wasn't. Bottom left is 1989. And you can see the tremendous deterioration that first canal has caused, and you see these other canals over there and some significant deterioration that has already begun in those canals. Bottom right is 2008, and of course it's worse now. You can see it's all open water. That damage was done by the oil and gas activity. That was not done because of a lack of sediment. So I guess I froze. Did I freeze it? Okay. Some expert here. Thank you, Nick. I should never push buttons. Okay, thank you. Okay, this is, as I said, it's statewide problem. This is Lafourche Parish. This is Golden Meadow. You can see, better not point a laser. I don't want to do that. You know, could have done the same time lapse, 63 to 2014. You can see all the canals, and that land turned to water. Go back for a second. The floodplain of the Mississippi River does not extend all across the state of Louisiana, as you know, here living in Shrevary. It goes about 2/3 of the way across. If there was not a single levee anywhere on the Mississippi River, the river would not flood the western part of the state. So it would never see water as sediment from floodwaters in the Mississippi River. So therefore, there would be no land loss if it were just the levees when you get to the western part of the state. So that's Cameron Parish. That's oil and gas activity. Levees have absolutely nothing to do with that activity. Okay. This is a slide of a sort of a classic U.S. Geological Survey study, which included scientists from Exxon, Amoco, and was funded, and other industry groups, and was funded partly by the industry. It also included the Argonne National Laboratory, the Corps of Engineers, NOAA, and practically every university in Louisiana that studies the coast. I'm not sure if LSUS is included in that. And the consensus conclusion, including the industry scientists, was that 36% of the land loss was caused by oil and gas activity. This is an affidavit given in 2006 for the state of Louisiana by Bob B., who is, as it says, Shell's chief offshore engineer for about 20 years. He also headed the National Science Foundation team which investigated what went wrong during Katrina. And you can read for yourself. You know, he attests to the fact he was personally involved in doing things that destroyed natural barriers, and that those barriers, their loss, contributed to the breaches of flood protection facilities during Katrina. Direct link. 37 studies, including by Mid-Continent Oil and Gas and the American Petroleum Institute, all reach the same conclusion. They may vary in their percentages, but every one of them says oil and gas is responsible for part of the problem. Nobody says it's responsible for all the problem. The Mid-Continent study doesn't put a number on it, but does say overwhelming majority of land loss, that's a direct quote from the Mid-Continent study, is oil and gas activity. This is, as it says, DNR in 2006. May not be able to read that. But in parts, this was not a statewide study, it was parts of the Barataria and Terrebonne Basin. It says that there was so much canal activity, 12%, the physical space the canals occupy, just the physical space of the canals, accounts for 12% of all the land loss. And the damage they do by saltwater intrusion and interfering with the natural flow of water in and out created another 64% of the land loss. 76% of the land loss in this area of the state, according to the Department of Natural Resources, is caused by oil and gas activity. So this is, I didn't realize this was animated, so that highlights the stuff I just read to you. Now the industry is saying that they operated according to the law, and that we are trying retroactively to apply today's laws to what they did back then. Is it the truth? Well, going back to 1920, there are state laws and federal laws that say that's not the case. You've got, you know, in 1952, about the time people started getting serious about offshore, those canals cannot interfere with anything. No injury. Keep the banks of those waterways shall be intact. And then by 74, everything, the language changes a little bit. It's not supposed to expand. They're not supposed to erode further the land. They're supposed to stay exactly the way the drawings that are attached to each permit. Then comes 1980. That's what it says. This is state law in 1980, since 1980. This governs every permit issued since 1980. When you're done, you're supposed to restore the land, quote, as near as practicable to their original condition. Backfilled or otherwise restored to pre-existing conditions. That's state law since 1980. This is a typical permit. Every permit is a little different. They're negotiated. They're like a contract. And they're a contractual obligation. A company comes, asks for a permit, they get a permit in return for the right to drill. Number one, they're governed by the previous slide, state law. And number two, they're governed by their specific permit. They're all different, but they all include language like this. So why, if the industry has agreed to permits, their contracts, and the industry agreed to fix this stuff itself, and state law requires them to fix this stuff itself, this is the annual plan for fiscal 2015, right now, next year, from the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority, and the next couple of pages of more details. See that top right, oil field restoration projects. This is you, your tax dollars are going to pay, going to firm, $5.5 million. Why? To plug two major oil pipelines. Your dollars, you're paying for that. $5.9 million. Why? Oil field access canals were plugged. $5.1 million. Same thing. Go to that one, $39 million. Hydrologically degraded by interior exposure from the oil field canal breaches. So you're paying for oil field canal closures. Total is $61 million. That's your tax money. This is a permit for, this is the first thing on that slide. This is a close-up detail of what that Point of Fur project was. That cost $5.5 million to fix. This was dredged in 1982. It was a dry hole. It was abandoned in 1983. The permit said, shall be constructed within 90 days. It's 30 years later, we're still waiting. So it made the priority list because it was causing so much damage. Your tax dollars are now paying to close what that oil company agreed to close within 90 days. And you say, well, that's 30 years ago. I mean, come on. What do you now? Give it a rest. Same thing. This is 2011. Same thing. Closed within 90 days. Now imagine how much damage this is causing. Think about the bureaucracy. This was closed in 2011. And it already made the annual plan last year. And overnight, how much damage can be caused and it makes a priority list that quickly through a government process? It should have been plugged within 90 days. This is a map of what New Orleans will look like in 2100, or the Louisiana coast will look like in 2100, which has been used by, we got the map from the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority. We did not make the map up. And we did add the names of towns that aren't going to be there anymore, so that you have a point of reference. Lafayette is almost beachfront property. Shreveport's a long way from the beach yet. That's what it's going to look like if nothing is done. This is Rotary, so I'll skip over the polls. Is it the truth? Don Briggs, the head of the Louisiana Oil and Gas Association, has been, for years, been talking about all these terrible lawsuits against the industry that have cost the state tens of thousands of jobs. This is a deposition under oath he gave 2 weeks ago. Do you have any evidence that any oil company considers Louisiana's legal climate in deciding whether to drill? No. Is it your opinion oil and gas companies are leaving Louisiana because of lawsuits? Yes. Which oil companies have left? I don't know. Give us a name of an oil company that has refused to do business in Louisiana because of lawsuits. I don't know any. You can't name a single company that is not drilled because of lawsuits? No. Is it the truth? Now, I'm not telling you he's lying because I think he sincerely believes what he's talking about. But the reality is, the studies that he's citing, I mean, it's all self-referential. Who's been talking about this stuff for a lot longer than I have, asked me to show you this. These are pipelines in the state. There's 40,000 miles of them. It's kind of hard for the oil industry to leave that infrastructure. Plus, all the oil and gas is in this area. And they'll stay as long as the oil is here. I am not against the industry. Our board is not against the industry. As I said earlier, I work for the industry. But I believe the industry should do what it said it was going to do, and do what the law requires it to do. And I want to make another point on jobs. If you fund a coastal restoration effort, stop and think for a second how many jobs are going to be created. The reality is tens of thousands. In fact, we think we're going to have a study that will come out fairly soon. Over 100,000 jobs if we fund the master plan. And these are permanent jobs. They're not just construction temporary jobs. The Dutch make $8.9 billion a year exporting their technology on how to handle water. After Katrina, there are more Dutch in New Orleans than there were New Orleans residents who would come back. The Dutch go all over the world selling their expertise. This is a kind of great job, good job, really, intellectual knowledge, intellectual capital. That is the future. Boone Pickens said, water is the oil of the 21st century. Every coastal area in the world is facing exactly what Louisiana is facing right now. It's unfortunate that we're at the point of despair, but at least we can turn that into an opportunity. And this is the, there should be another slide there, I forgot it's been omitted, I put it back. How much money does the master plan have? As you probably know in this room, the state has developed a master plan. We've lost 2,000 square miles. We are not going to restore that 2,000 square miles. That land is gone forever. But what we can do, and the master plan was passed unanimously by the legislature and was praised by both the scientific community and the environmental community. It is strongly supported by the oil and gas industry because it protects its own infrastructure. What we can do is build a sustainable future for the coast. We can't protect everything, but we can protect a lot of it. And we can protect the infrastructure of the oil and gas industry. That plan costs $50 billion. At the $50 billion level, you don't stop land loss, but you do build a sustainable future. If you've got $100 billion, then you can actually gain some land. You can't gain the 2,000 square miles we lost, but we can get ahead of where we are right now. There's no money for that plan. The only money the state has for the master plan is whatever comes to it from the BP settlement, and the number that I hear talked about as to what will actually filter down to coastal restoration is $3.5 billion. But let's say, for the sake of argument, it's double that. Let's say it's $7 billion. It's still a $50 billion plan. The only other money coming to the state is from, starting in 2017, Mary Landrieu got a bill passed a few years ago that will send money from offshore production to the state. But according to the State Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority, that will be about $100 million to $200 million a year. You can't build a $50 billion plan with that money. And the state has to start paying back, beginning in 2017, the same time that money starts coming in, you got to start paying the federal government $73 million a year for the cost share for the levee system around metropolitan New Orleans. It does not add up. The only way that we have to protect and save our coast is to ask the industry, or actually demand from the industry, that is responsible for part of the problem, that they address the part of the problem that they created. That's it. And right now, the legislature, the industry, and the government want the legislature to kill the lawsuit. I find this deeply offensive. First, as a practical matter, if the lawsuit survives the legislature, I can tell you as a statement of fact, not of wishful thinking, that there will be serious discussions about getting around the table and solving a problem for the entire state, or the entire coast. Those conversations have already begun with top people in the industry. They're informal, and there's not a lot of action while the legislature might kill the lawsuit. But if the legislature does not kill the lawsuit, those conversations will get very serious very quickly. And the very idea that, and I mean, think about it, one of the figures in my last book is a guy very few of you in this room ever heard of, Sir Edward Cook. But Cook, 400 years ago, almost to the day, made a ruling that everybody, he was the Chief Justice of England, made a ruling from the bench that everybody in this room is familiar with. He said, the house of everyone is as his castle. And back then there were great lords with real castles and private armies. What he was saying in that ruling is a basic fundamental precept of American society. He was saying that this great lord up there with the castle and the private army, when it comes to the law, he has no more rights and privileges than this peasant down here in a mud hut. And the idea that everybody is equal before the law is so fundamental to us. But the industry is going to the legislature and says, well, wait a second, there's a lawsuit already filed, well, we don't like it. We're above the law. We're above the law. Kill that lawsuit in the legislature. I don't care whether you think it's the worst idea in the history of Louisiana or whether you support the lawsuit. But the idea of the legislature intervening when it's already in court, I find reprehensible. And I think every American should be offended by that. And I used up most of my time. I did want to leave some for questions and just a little left, so I'll shut up. Thank you. Question? Yes, sir. Those are the best ones usually.
If there's no issuing permits to drill, right?
Right.
So, to me, the easy thing would be just, until you fix it, you don't get any more permits.
Well, I would say that, we're talking about past damage. I am not against the industry. I think society needs the energy that they produce. And I think operations being conducted today are not conducted the way they used to be conducted. And there's enough attention now, I guarantee you in future, they're going to, this was never really debated before. The only person who ever brought it up was Foster Campbell. I think current operations I'm not complaining about. I certainly don't think we should stop issuing permits.
I didn't mean it to literally stop, but I mean, make it more difficult to issue the permits.
Well, I would just make sure that they're enforced. That's all we need to do. Okay, and the reality is the political muscle of the industry in the last 30, 40 years, if you go back to the 50s and earlier, the state actually was very aggressive in enforcing the permits. But the industry ended up taking over the political process and is responsible for the lack of enforcement in more recent decades. Just start enforcing the future permits and we'll be in much better shape. So another question? Yes, sir.
Are the laws on the books now sufficient for restoration?
Absolutely. Those laws that I cited since 1980, they're still in force, and all we need to do is enforce them. And again, what the lawsuit asks is for the industry to obey the law and to do what it promised to do. They have some legal defenses, and one of the chief ones is going to be, well, it was so long ago, how do you hold us to that standard now? Well, let the courts decide. Let the courts, that's all we want. Let the courts decide. Let the judicial process work its way out. The truth is, if the legislature does not kill the lawsuit, I don't believe this is ever going to court. Because we don't want to go to court. We want a solution to the problem. And the problem is not the lawsuit. The problem is the erosion of the coast, the coastal land loss. So we don't want to go to court, and frankly, neither does the industry, because they understand how big their liability is, and it's pretty big. And I would rather have a happy conversation. The day I filed the lawsuit, and practically every day since, I said, whether you agree with the governor or not on most issues, and on most issues I do not, he has been a good governor for the coast. And all I asked of him was that he become a great governor for the coast. And all he had to do was pick up the phone and talk to some people in the industry saying, you know what, guys? It's time to sit down at the table. It's time. And with his leadership, it would have happened months ago. Even without his leadership, if the lawsuit does survive, as I said, we're having informal conversations right now. And those, if we survive the legislature, those conversations are going to get very serious very quickly. So, it's 12:58. Thank you very much.